Countries are increasingly using preferential trade arrangements to liberalize trade. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the background information surrounding these preferential trade arrangements. Have three parts. One is to define the terms that are used in this context, and to also bring up some of the issues associated with different types of PTAs, including transshipment and the very complicated set of rules of origin that are particularly important with FTAs, the free trade agreements, and also to outline some of the GATT rules surrounding PTAs. So when we talk about a PTA, let me first make clear that this is an exception to the core WTO principle of MFN. Some countries are being treated better than other countries, contrary to the MFN status of the WTO, where everybody is treated the same. So there are going to be increasing levels of integration associated with these PTAs. The first one, at least in the textbook definition, is so-called Free Trade Agreement, or FTA. And under this arrangement, countries will eliminate restrictions with their other club members, if you will, but will continue to have independent policies towards non-members. So, for example, when the U.S. and Canada put together an FTA in the late 80s, the U.S. and Canada can continue to have quite distinct and separate policies towards Cuba. A further level of integration is a so-called customs union. That has every aspect of an FTA, that is to say, the elimination of barriers among members, but countries agree to have a common policy towards non-members. I think this will be more clear in just a bit. A further level of integration is a common market. This has every aspect of a customs union, the common policies and towards non-members and elimination of trade restrictions among the partners, but also typically allows for the free movement of factors, the free movement of labor across borders, the free movement of capital across borders. So in many ways, the European Union is a kind of customs or a common market. They have customs union aspects, plus it's pretty easy for workers to move across borders within Europe. There's some restrictions, and there's essentially no restrictions on the ability of companies to move capital, either financial capital or FDI, across the borders of the European Union. A final level of economic integration would be an economic union. An economic union would have all the aspects of the common market, plus a common set of tax and fiscal policies, common monetary policies, maybe even a common currency. So the economic union is really a description of the United States of America, and the European Union is making at least significant movements towards that economic union, even if they're not there yet. Now, taking a look at this list, it's only the first two that actually deal with movements of goods and services across borders and WTO commitments. So let's be clear, it's only FTAs and customs unions that WTO rules address. The common market, the free movement of labor and capital, the fiscal, monetary policy, currency policies, those are really outside of the purview of the GATT. So the WTO has certain commitments that members agree to surrounding these preferential trade agreements. On an FTA, which is both the FTA and the customs unions are treated under Article 24 of the GATT, The commitments under the agreements require that the restrictions on non-members cannot be increased. You can eliminate the barriers among your buddies, but you can't increase the tariffs on non-members. We'll talk about this in a particular example in a moment. With the customs union, since there'll be a common policy towards non-members, there could be some instances where some goods tariffs go up for a particular member and go down for another. So it's looking at the policies as a whole. Again, this will be clearer in an example in just a moment. And there's a requirement for compensation. Again, we'll talk about this in more detail. The other expectation is that the restrictions, both under an FTA or a customs union, need to be removed by members on substantially all trade and within a reasonable amount of time. So the idea is that an FTA or customs union won't be, say, only for the auto industry or only for the agricultural industry. It should be for trade as a whole. Now, some agreements in practice don't meet these criteria, and it's possible that a member could bring a dispute settlement case against two other WTO members who are not living up to these provisions, but in practice that really has not occurred. So I think it's helpful to look at a particular example to illustrate some of these issues. So let's imagine that you've got tariffs in the US and Canada in the auto industry. And the initial tariffs that are applied on everybody are the MFN tariffs. So for the US, they're charging 5% on automobile imports from whatever source. Canada has a 10% tariff on autos from whatever source. And let's imagine that the US and Canada decide to form a free trade agreement. So the US will charge the Canadians 0%, the Canadians charge the Americans 0%, so they eliminate the tariffs on autos, but they maintain the 5 and 10% tariff margins on non-members. 5% for the US, 10% for Canada. Now this creates an incentive for what's called transshipment. The Japanese, who are not members of this club, have the incentive that they can avoid the 10% tariff in Canada by bringing the autos into the United States, pay the 5%, and then sell autos within Canada and avoid the higher tariffs on Canada. They transship. They take advantage of the free trade agreement by avoiding the higher tariff country. So there are these strong incentives to transship. Now this is not news to the negotiators, so that there are complicated rules of origin to qualify for duty-free treatment across the Canadian-US border. For example, you might say that in order for a product to be considered for duty-free treatment, that 60% of the content needs to be made within the US and or Canada in order to get duty-free access across the US-Canadian border. Anything below that is considered foreign and subject to the standard MFN tariffs. But one of the complications with this is that you start to require that companies have documentation about where specifically they source different inputs. Now, if it's some product like wheat or coal, a product that only has one stage of production, very few intermediate inputs, this is really not a problem. But just imagine an automobile. An automobile made with Japanese engines, Canadian chassis, American tires, a Malaysian carburetor or fuel injection system, the computer system made in South Korea. It gets to be much more complicated in a complex world where supply chains are from around the world. So in a modern economy, a modern world economy where there are complicated products sourced from different areas, the rules of origin really does get to be a burden on businesses. So there's this tendency to have these complicated rules, but an alternative would be to have a customs union. So let's take a look at this example again. Again, the initial tariffs, 5% and 10% in the US and Canada. The US and Canada eliminate tariffs on each other, but with a customs union, they will, the two, US and Canada, will have the same restrictions on other countries, which avoids some of these problems of transshipment. There's no particular advantage to go into Canada or the US if you have a common tariff. So the Canadians could lower their tariffs from 10% to 5% on non-members, essentially come to the US rates. And this is really the easiest one to implement because no one's tariff has been increased. The Canadians have dropped theirs on both non-members and on US products. The US has kept the tariffs on non-members, lowered it on Canadian products. So this is relatively easy to implement, but it's clearly going to be potentially controversial within Canada. The Canadians have not only eliminated tariffs on the Americans, but have also lowered their tariffs on the world as a whole. But this would be an illustration of a customs union where you don't have the same kinds of complications of transshipment. So this is one alternative. Another alternative to have a common policy is for the Americans to raise their tariff on non-customs union partners to the Canadian. So the Canadian rates. So the U.S. could raise its tariff on non-members from 5% to 10%. Again, no incentives for transshipment, but there is the problem that Americans have now eliminated or reduced the ability of some other WTO members to operate inside the U.S. economy because they've raised tariffs on non-PTA members. Now, the way the WTO rules are written, and if you go back and look at the earlier discussion, in this instance, the U.S. may need to offer compensation to other countries for raising the tariffs from 5% to 10%. This is something that can be complicated and controversial. For example, if the U.S. were to increase the tariffs on automobiles on the Japanese in order to come into concordance with the Canadians, well, the U.S. may say to Japan, well, we're going to lower the tariffs on certain steel imports. Well, that's going to make the U.S. steel industry irritated. They don't want to essentially pay for the automobile industry's tariff increase. So it gets to be complicated when you try and offer compensation to the non-members. So in summary, the free trade agreement has certain advantages under both the WTO rules and in a practical way by allowing there to be divergence in policies towards non-members. You don't have to change the policy towards non-members. You can keep your own policies towards non-members. But it does require complicated rules to determine whether or not a particular product qualifies to have that free trade agreement tariff rate. Rules of origin are increasingly complicated. The world has far more FTAs than they have had in the past. In a world of complicated supply chains, that makes it very difficult for businesses to operate. A customs union, on the other hand, requires a far more deep level of coordination of policies across member governments. You have to come to a common external tariff. That means a more integrated economy, but compromises to reach the common policies toward others, and has the complication of requiring compensation to countries that have possibly seen their access to a market reduced because of an increase in particular tariffs. It does reduce the problems with transshipment and rules of origin, but it certainly comes with its own set of disadvantages.